Pankaj, well, we don't have the confirmations of that, but apparently the panel of secretaries has cleared these divestment, and that's why all of these companies are up and about in trade. But that seemed to be the only alternative. With the borrowing target being kept as it is, you would have to presume that the government will be very aggressive on the divestment front. Would you believe, therefore, that PSUs are firmly in the hunt again? They've been shunned for a long period of time. They may not be the greatest of companies, but from a tactical perspective, PSUs are back in the hunt?
Yes, I think so, because the business value or strategic value is much higher. Investors have had a disliking for them because across the board, across sectors, PSUs in terms of their shareholder returns have not done well over the last 5 years or 7 years, if you see. In fact, there's been significant erosion that has happened in their market cap and wealth. And obviously the biggest loser has been government, because they are the largest shareholders. Given that the government is constrained and they need significant resources. And obviously once some of these businesses move in the hands of private sector, I think their efficiency and productivity can be enhanced significantly, right? And in fact, experience tells us, if you go by past history of divestments, whenever companies have been divestment, classic cases Hindustan Zinc, their productivity and efficiency gains and eventually their profit growth and return ratios have, over the next 5-7 years post the divestment, have grown multifold, because private sector can squeeze the assets much better, drive them much more efficiently, and so on and so forth. So I think this time unfortunately governments work or act only when they're pushed to the corner. And seems like this time the government is being pushed into a corner. So hopefully this should sail through, and if that does happen, then I think there is value unlocking that will happen in a lot of these companies. It's not about just the divestment, but I think the more important thing is sweating the assets and driving better productivity from the assets post the divestment. That's where the real gains are.
And where do you think, with the assumption, and again, all of this is a hypothesis, right? We can only work on assumptions, but with an assumption that some of these companies get handed back or get handed to the private sector, which of these government assets do you believe hold the potential for some multi-year profitability and operational gains? Would it be all marketing companies? Would it be something else?
I think across the board, because these companies are pretty large in their respective sectors. They're actual dominant players. You look at the oil marketing companies, you look at Concor, which has been talked about, you look at Coal India, they are very dominant or leaders in their respective sectors. Having said that, because they are owned by government, and I think there are a lot of low-hanging fruits that exist in these companies, meaning the average salary cost of Coal India, is 3x of what exists in the private sector. With about, I don't know the last number, but I think they have about 2.8 lakh or 2.6 lakh employees. And if you look at it on the metrics in terms of productivity per employee or the output per employee, probably it will be one of the weakest. Obviously, government can't fire people and so on and so forth. Private sector can give them a respectable VRS, drive productivity through significantly more investment into better equipments and to drive efficiency and so on and so forth. And I think those kind of opportunities exist across the board with all of these companies. So I think if we really, and I think the government itself could be the biggest beneficiary of it in terms of the value unlocking that can happen.
It's interesting you say Coal India, because I may be, shooting way too early, but with all countries getting so conscious about the environment, and we just had the Bloomberg Global Summit right now, where there was a talk about the whole new clean world and countries moving towards cleaner fuels, biofuels, and they actually projecting a big drop in consumption and of thermal power in a way, and thermal fuels. So do you feel that in light of that, Coal India, in its own case, the purpose stands defeated?
See, while everyone is conscious of the challenges that lie ahead in terms of climate, the fact is, I think, as far as India is concerned, I think we're trying to jump the gun. The most developed countries in the world, including US, Europe, China, and China is now a developed economy, being the second largest one, they have been the biggest contributor to pollution and environmental hazard over the last 30-40 years. India is just embarked on the journey of industrialization. Our contribution to global warming and all of that is minuscule as compared to.
But doesn't mean we keep adding to it to come to that.
On an incremental basis, even though, see, the point is, while we need to take care of the environment, we also need to balance that with our own growth and developmental needs. India needs thermal power because you cannot have, the entire ecosystem run on green energies because they are not stable. So your base power requirement has to be either thermal or nuclear. The nuclear industry in India is almost very nascent kind of thing. And obviously, we got access to nuclear power only just about 7-8 years back, because until then we didn't have access to nuclear fuels because some of these global developed economies were not willing to supply us the fuel. Yeah, so we need, if we want to grow and accelerate our growth, we need to meet our development needs. We need power because that's one of the core requirements, and we have no choice but to go to thermal. So I think as far as India is concerned, our coal consumption will keep rising for the next 15 or 20 years. It's not going to fall off.
The other pocket I want to talk about is, obviously you've been following what's been happening to PMC and the big swirl around there around cooperative banks, but not just cooperative banks. Do you feel that this brings about a little bit of a scare amongst the retail investors as to maybe the smaller rung PSU banks, which up until now, some of them have moved out of the PCA, but it's still a big question mark, and there could be a big risk out there?
I don't think so. As far as state-owned banks are concerned, I think the buck stops with government, they being the principal shareholders, and now I think they've taken the second step forward in terms of having the second round of merger and all of that. So I don't see any of those risks with any of the state-owned banks. If at all, I think now it seems like they've been adequately capitalized. Even if they run short of capital, I think the government will have to step in. Cooperative banks, this has been one pocket of the whole banking system which has been around, and if you go across, meaning I can talk about Maharashtra, but something similar happens in UP and some of the larger states. It's been a long time. Politicians have used them as a vehicle to fund and finance a lot of their activities. And the only thing which disappoints me is I think it would have been better off had the regulator been slightly more proactive in dealing with some of those issues, because while these issues have been cropping up now, the cooperative banks have gaps in their governance, in their operations. It's been known, to the community and to the regulator for a long time. And the regulator, I think, somehow has probably had dealt with them with a very loose hand,
So tightening the nose now.
Yeah, I should have done it. I think they should have done it much earlier.
Okay. I have one final question, Pankaj, today, and that's on Telecom. The reason I bring that up, again, topical in nature, this conversation is very different from the ones that we've had in the past, but because it's a lot more topical. Yesterday, there was this talk of maybe Jio raising some prices, as a result of which Bharti, Vodafone, Reliance, all of them went up. They've come down today. Do you think it's sooner rather than later that would happen? And therefore, is there a bet that you would make on Telecom, on any of these three names?
We own telecom names, including.
You own Telecom.
We own Reliance, which is effectively now the largest player as well. I think so. I think the worst is clearly behind from India's telecom growth story. We are just, I think we've had this conversation earlier. We are just embarking on a data consumption story.
Oh yeah, we've had this conversation.
Data consumption in India has grown at something like 15x over the last 2 years. And still, I think that will grow exponentially. My view is, meaning the average data consumption today is about 8 GB or something. This can be like keep growing at 15-20% for the next 10 years. And now that you just three players, it's kind of oligopoly kind of industry structure. So I think these guys are here to make money for a long time, because now for the next 15 or 20 years, I don't see a new entrant coming into the sector. Yeah. So, and it's a business with very high operating leverage. So, meaning once you generate incremental volumes and revenues, 80% of that, if you take away government taxes, 80% of that flows to your operating profits. So it's a business where the operating leverage is very, very significant.
Yeah.
So, meaning we are pretty positive. I'm pretty positive on the sector.
Okay. Well, let's wait and watch. Hopefully, 1 year down the line, Pankaj, when we talk about this, the sector would have generated some results or returns for the investors as well. Reliance has probably done that. The others probably need to step in. But take a moment to thank you for joining in today and giving us your perspective. Really appreciate your time today.
Thank you.